Welcome everyone to this IES webinar, Net Gain and the Marine Environment. The webinar will discuss the challenges associated with implementing biodiversity net gain in marine and intertidal environments, and will explore possible approaches to introducing and delivering a system of marine net gain. I'm delighted today to be joined by Vicky West, a senior consultant at ABP MER, 7 years experience in marine and coastal ecology. Vicky specialises in marine net gain and in 2019 was an advisor on Natural England's Biodiversity Net Gain Coastal and Intertidal Sounding Board. We will hear from Vicky and then you'll have the opportunity to ask questions. So please do submit these in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen at any point during the presentation, and I will then read these on your behalf later on. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the IES YouTube channel in a few weeks. Thanks so much for joining everyone, and a massive thank you to Vicky. I'll now hand over to you.
Hi, hopefully you can all hear me. Thank you for the introduction and for inviting me to speak to you all today. As said, I'm Vicky and I'm a senior consultant at ABP MER, and one of the areas I specialise in is marine net gain. I've also co-authored several white papers and supported on the development for recommendations for strategic targets for marine net gain. So I'm hoping with this webinar I can give you a bit of background into what biodiversity net gain is, because I'm not sure how many people on the course know the principles behind it. And then I'm going to try and look more specifically at the aspirations for biodiversity net gain in the marine environment. And then as part of that, I'll try and touch on some of the challenges associated with implementing net gain in the marine environment and explore some possible approaches to actually introducing and delivering a system of marine net gain. So I guess going right back to the beginning, so what is actually the problem? Well, there's increasing recognition of the need for greater action to actually restore the marine environment in the face of continued decline in marine biodiversity. And that's occurring for a wide range of reasons, population growth, climate change, etc. But there is really a policy and legislative gap that's limiting the ability for marine managers to actually reverse that decline. And net gain offers a valuable approach that can actually contribute to halting that loss. So biodiversity net gain is a broad term, but it's basically used to describe the idea that in addition to ensuring development doesn't have a significant environmental impact, that there's actually a positive move to improve and add to biodiversity value as part of that development process. So it first includes the mitigation hierarchy being applied in full before net gain requirements are applied. So under the mitigation hierarchy, a developer should avoid, mitigate and restore where possible before offsetting. Net gain would then effectively be the final step, and to meet net gain requirements, a development should provide a 10% increase in biodiversity. I should also say here that there is a difference between biodiversity net gain, which is what I'm referring to throughout this presentation, and that's an uplift in biodiversity. But then there's also something called environmental net gain, and that considers a wider benefits to the range of impacts. So it looks more at a natural capital approach. So the Environment Bill cites biodiversity net gain, which is why that's what I'm going to talk about. But there are also some references to environmental net gain by policymakers. So it's just worth having that in the back of your mind. So currently biodiversity net gain applies to terrestrial and intertidal environments, but as my slide suggests, marine net gain is really lagging behind, and there's currently no formal policy or requirement for net gain as part of marine development. It is, however, understood that it's probably going to become likely or mandatory in the near future. So to start with, terrestrial net gain is focused on development activities, and we're seeing that even in advance of legislation being enacted, the principles of net gain delivery were being enforced under the planning process. And more recently, we're seeing this for intertidal habitats too. In both of these areas, terrestrial and intertidal, there's been an accounting mechanism or sort of a metric that's been developed that actually quantifies the impact of the development in terms of those biodiversity units. So it looks at the losses and gains associated with development, and it's designed to provide a transparent method to actually represent biodiversity. But just taking a step back, I just want to look at where we are and how we got here in the net gain timeline. So back in January 2018, the government published the 25-year environment plan. And within that plan, they identified a commitment to embed environmental net gain principle for development, including housing and infrastructure. They then subsequently consulted to improve planning in England, and it was at this point that they decided to introduce a system to achieve biodiversity net gain under the Town and Country Planning Act. So in March 2019, the government then confirmed that they were going to make biodiversity net gain mandatory under the Town and Country Planning Act. And that meant that it was going to include habitats down to mean low water, so terrestrial and intertidal. Up until this point, there had been some development of a terrestrial metric, but in response, Natural England began work on their intertidal metric. And that's where the work of the Intertidal Sounding Board came in to help sort of develop that. There was a consultation on that intertidal metric, which ran from September 2019 to February 2020, and it sort of led to the update of the biodiversity metric, which was at the time 3.0. Along that time as well, January 2020, the Environment Bill was introduced to Parliament, and the bill provides the statutory system for implementing net gain. It did stall for quite a while in Parliament, mainly as a result of COVID, but in May 2021, it was then reintroduced. And at the point it was reintroduced, it then included nationally significant infrastructure projects, or NSIPs, because up until then they had been exempt. The bill then received royal assent in November 2021, so we now have the Environment Act 2021. Although the Act is now in place, net gain won't technically become mandatory for 2 years, so not till November 2023, but in reality, we are actually seeing it being requested already. And then in January of this year, Defra issued a further consultation on some of the policy implementation of biodiversity net gain. That consultation closed fairly recently on the 5th of April, and we're just awaiting to hear some of the responses from that. And then, as I mentioned in my last slide, there is currently no formal policy for the marine environment. Defra are expected to be launching a consultation on marine net gain principles. It was expected in November last year. We've still not had an update on it, but we're thinking we'll probably see something this summer. In the meantime, though, there has been a lot of wider work ongoing on how marine net gain might be applied. So before I go on to some of the approaches suggested for marine net gain, I just want to quickly discuss some of the current processes for intertidal net gain via the use of the metric calculator, because there is a possibility that a similar approach could be applied to the marine environment. So the most up-to-date metric calculator is now actually version 3.1. It was released on the 25th of April. For anyone who's interested and wants to see the metric, supporting documentations and some examples as well, it's all available on the Natural England website. So the aim of the metric is basically to provide a measure to calculate net gain for development. It works by calculating the number of biodiversity units a site scores before development, how many units will then be lost because of that development, and how many you'll need either on-site or off-site to actually achieve that 10% net gain relative to the baseline. So you do an initial calculation to determine these baseline units, and there are multiple criteria that feed into it. You look at the area, the distinctiveness of the habitat condition, whether the site falls into an area that's classified as strategically significant. You add all of those up, it gives you a score. You then repeat the process to calculate those post-development units. And this accounts for any on-site measures that you'll do to retain or enhance biodiversity, but then it will also look at any off-site units that you might require. And within this, there are also some additional factors that are included, and these are risk factors. So they look at the likelihood of failure for those offset actions, and they consider the risk of delivery, a temporal risk, how long it will take to get up to the standard, and also a spatial risk, so how far away is it from the loss. There are also some trading rules under the metric which need to be satisfied, and I don't unfortunately have time to go into all of those today, but the metric calculator does work these out for you. And effectively within the calculator, you'll sort of see this end screen, and at the bottom here, you would see whether your trading rules have been satisfied. So you get a yes, and ultimately, once you put it all in, you need a 10% uplift, and again, it shows you this here, shown in the green. As part of the supporting documentation that's on Natural England's website, they've put in a few case studies, and I want to run through one of the examples with you. So in this case study, we have a new jetty on the Thames. It's outside of any designated site, and the development's going to lead to the complete loss of habitat within that site, so it's going to require some creation off-site. Within the project boundary, we have salt marsh, we have littoral mud, and we have coarse sediment. So salt marsh and littoral mud are both considered high distinctiveness habitats, so they'll need to be replaced for like habitat, and that's one of the trading rules. Coarse sediment is medium distinctiveness, so it can be replaced by other habitats of the same distinctiveness or higher. Also important for this example is to note that the development is of low strategic significance because these habitats at this site haven't been identified in a local strategy. Effectively, when you add all of that together and you put it into the metric, this area has a baseline biodiversity unit value of 2.37 units. Our developer is then going to contract a landowner to undertake some habitat creation off-site. In this example, the land is adjacent to our development, and the landowner is going to build a tidal exchange scheme where seawater can flood in and out by breaching the seawall. This is going to be undertaken on an area of poor quality coastal land. But what's important to note here is that this is classified as artificial, unvegetated, unsealed surface. And this particular habitat doesn't receive a score for baseline biodiversity units. So we've got our 0 shown here in the box. The site is considered high strategic significance because it's been identified in a local strategy as suitable for intertidal mud and salt marsh creation. And the spatial risk is low because it's being created in the same marine plan area. So all of that adds up to create 2.61 biodiversity units. So we've made our 10% net gain, which is brilliant. And in this particular example, that equated to 0.17 hectares of salt marsh and 0.49 hectares of mudflat. So we've effectively, created 0.66 hectares of land, but we lost 0.16 hectares. So when you actually look at the area values of that, that's a 4.15 to 1 ratio. So every hectare we lost, we had to replace it with 4.15 hectares. And we'd also argue that there's a few assumptions associated with this, which are potentially atypical of potentially a port development or something similar. So I know there's been a lot of numbers, but I just want you to bear with me because I want to change the scenario. We're going to run use the exact same example, but we're going to tweak it a little bit. So we're still going to have our new jetty on the Thames. We're going to have the exact same habitats. We've got our salt marsh, littoral mud, and our coarse sediment. So we've still got our same baseline units. This is the 2.37 that we have. But some of the off-site criteria are going to be different. We're going to change them a bit. And the ones I've changed, I'm showing here in orange. So we're going to stay in the same marine plan area adjacent to the development. But unlike the last example, the area is not going to be strategically significant. That's going to stay low. The baseline habitat is still going to be of a poor quality coastal land, but we're now going to call it vacant derelict bare ground, as opposed to that artificial unvegetated surface. So this now means that ultimately we have an off-site baseline score, which is what this 3.6 is here. So now that we have that score and you add all that together in the metric, to actually gain the 10% uplift we need this 6.22 score. And that means that now equates to 1.8 hectares of land against the 0.16 hectares that we lost. So we're now getting a ratio of 11.25 to 1. And we'd still argue that this is actually quite a fair example, because should your offsite creation not be in the same marine plan area or close to the development, that ratio is going to increase further still. And should there also be greater loss of salt marsh instead of mudflat, that would increase on top of that again. And so this is why throughout its development, there has been some concern from industry that the scores achieved are not necessarily appropriate, and that in some cases the metric to calculate all this can be quite overly detailed. It's worth mentioning here as well that there's a lot of concern that the application of the metric only down to mean low water is of concern, because for any industry such as a port or a cable company or anyone that operates across the boundary are going to have to potentially have multiple accounting mechanisms. I just want to then put these scores into context of the habitat regulation. So I've given you a comparison here, and this compares to sort of our 27 years of experience, AB Per's experience of delivering compensation under the habitats regulations. So for flood and coastal defence projects, we find these ratios are actually normally around 1 to 1. For port and other development projects, the ratios are higher and more ranging, but we're still generally seeing a 2 to 1 ratio or a 5.1 to 1 ratio. That's kind of our maximum, is that 5.5 that we see. And you also have to remember that ratios under the habitats regulations are deemed to be sufficient to protect our most important protected sites and secure that coherence of the MPA network. So on this basis, we'd probably expect that 10% net gain would require a ratio close to maybe 2.2 to 1 or at most 5 to 1, but not as close to 11 to 1 as we're seeing in some scenarios. But putting that all aside, how do we take what I've said and translate it to the marine environment? Well, introducing a system of net gain in the marine environment is recognised as being particularly difficult, especially in comparison to the terrestrial. And this really owing to the dynamic nature and the multiple different pressures on habitats and species from development activity. And there's also complex arrangements for marine management and licensing, and very varied interactions as well between a diverse range of users in the marine environment. These are all really important to consider. In addition, sort of the majority of estuaries and inshore coastal areas are already designated as mature sites or MPAs, and so that has a real possibility to limit the scope where marine net gain can be applied. So it is going to be really important to establish clear objectives and targets which can provide a focus for sort of developer-led actions. And ultimately, this has led to the recommendation that a strategic approach should be applied to the marine environment. So a recent report by the Strategic Net Gain Targets Task and Finish Group, this group was established through the Offshore Wind Evidence and Change Programme. So they commented that a strategic approach should be adopted for marine, and they said intertidal 2 net gain. And this process should be led by government, to which funding and delivery of projects should be contributed to by industry. And the Task and Finish Group, it comprised a range of organisations, including industry, regulators and conservation bodies. So as part of a report produced by the Task and Finish Group, they provided a robust set of strategic targets which set a clear direction for how developers could actually contribute to marine gain. So it recommended that these targets should first be based on our understanding where we're actually already failing marine environments. And it also recommended that targets should consider species and pressure reduction activities and not just look at habitats. It further recommended as well that marine net gain policy should be developed in the context of the dynamic nature the marine environment. I think it's once again worth adding here that as part of this strategic approach, the group recommended that net gain should be applied to intertidal development as well as marine to ensure that there was a consistent approach across the two areas. Separately to this, Defra's Offshore Wind Enabling Actions Programme, or OE, their marine net gain has also been progressing considerations for an approach for marine net gain. And it's this that we're thinking is going to form the basis of Defra's consultation later this year. So as opposed to a metric, to actually facilitate the strategic approach, the Task and Finish group recommended that funding for marine net gain should actually take the form of a contributions-based system, which would then generate funds for that strategic recovery and restoration. So off the back of the recommendation, we at ABP MER actually undertook a study on behalf of Defra to explore the feasibility of and look at options for how that contributions-based approach might look. It solely considered development below mean low water, because that's the scope of marine net gain as we currently stand, but it explored the potential risks and benefits of different approaches. So we looked at a range of approaches, which I've listed on this slide. So you can see we considered sector revenues, profitability, we looked at project capital expenditure or operational expenditure as well. And within all of those listed, we looked at the pros and cons of each approach. And then alongside this, we held a workshop with industry representatives to gain their views. Now, I will add here that this work was all being undertaken just on an exploratory basis, and it was just to gain an insight into industry preference. So it doesn't preclude any policy decisions at this time. Based on the feedback that came back from that workshop and also work that we did as part of the study, project capital expenditure was considered the best overall approach, as opposed to some of the others such as OPEX or profitability. It was really felt that that approach could be consistently applied across all marine sectors, with slight exception of marine aggregates. And it was also felt that data would be publicly available and less commercially sensitive than maybe some of the other options. Also, capital expenditure was felt to be related quite closely to business and also to a level project activity too. It was, however, recognised by industry in particular that this financial approach did weaken the link between marine net gain and the environmental impact of the project. And so moderating capital expenditure or other contributions by some form of environmental component was actually highly supported. So we explored some simple modifiers to such an approach, such as looking at, say, the physical footprint of the development on the seabed, or considering the amount of significant pressures from the development. And we conducted sort of some illustrative modelling to look at how that might sort of change some of the figures. So we considered the level of development that might occur between 2020 and 2050 to assess the potential net gain contributions. And then we modelled that against one of these environmental components. So my figure here basically shows the modelled example. It looked at what contributions could be paid based on a 1% capital expenditure, moderated by the number of significant environmental pressures for each sector. That timeline was then split into 3 different sub-periods as well to look at the change in development across time. But overall, what our modelling suggested that based on this 1% capex contribution, you could potentially raise around 50 million per year to fund marine net gain projects. And as you can see, offshore wind was one of the highest contributors, and that contribution increased across that period up to 2050. Oil and gas was also quite a high contributor, but you can see that after 2041, here, that contribution really drops off. And then other higher ones were power interconnectors and sort of tidal range power. And then all of the other contributions were made up from this vast range of other industries. There are obviously other marine net gain approaches as well that are being considered, and there's the feasibility of assessing net gain across development footprint, so more at a project specific level. So one way is that this would be a view of achieving biodiversity net gain for the individual project. And then alongside this, there's some sort of suggestion that we could develop an assessment framework which also considers these wider species impacts, especially for groups such as bird and mammals, especially in the marine environment for, say, offshore wind. And one of the benefits of, say, a project scale approach would be to allow companies to really enhance their corporate social responsibility status, that's CSR, by providing their own project-specific net gain enhancement. And that would provide benefits as well, potentially at a more local level. So that would be good from a company perspective. However, there are some limitations as well to this approach. And one of those is in terms of accurately assessing the impact of that. So there are models, sort of EcoSim, EcoSpan, but there's always a level of error associated with them. And we already find that getting an agreement on what those impacts would be, even for compensation purposes, is quite difficult, let alone maybe for net gain. There's then implementing the physical measures to actually enable gains for each receptor. So if you took birds for an example, a lot of measures which might improve or provide gains for birds are going to be linked to fisheries reduction pressure. And there's going to be an issue as one industry can't really pay another industry not to operate. And then there's also probably going to be a lot of assumptions associated with the values you come up with for that net gain loss or gain on the development. And it's whether those assumptions are going to gain stakeholder acceptance. Currently, there isn't actually a method or a plan for how you might assess a monetary value for that impact, those units, for want of a better term. But if a method was developed, then there is a potential the industry could pay into a fund or pay towards specific conservation objectives. So almost similar to a contribution-based approach, but it'd be linked at a more project-specific level. There's always going to be a difficulty with that of linking maybe the specific net gain impacts of that development, so your impacts on your birds, marine mammals, etc., to conservation objectives that link to those same receptor groups, but it could potentially be possible. And then another possible approach is to not treat net gain as distinct from the mitigation hierarchy, but rather use it as an opportunity to provide more than just compensation, but so that the environment is not just protected, but actually improved. The recent Defra consultation on the best practice for delivering compensatory measures in relation to marine protected areas did actually touch on this issue. And a feature of this approach would be that it would be applied regardless of whether this takes place within or outside of a designated area. And it could apply at a much more ecosystem-wide basis. So that would acknowledge that some species that require sort of terrestrial, marine and intertidal habitats throughout their life cycle. And this has been referred to as an ecosystem enhancement, and it could be of considerable value. Ultimately, whatever system is implemented, there are some general things which need to be considered. So the system needs to have a clear link to the development activity. It needs to be targeted, i.e. it needs to link to the residual scale of environmental impact. It needs to be transparent so that whatever information is used to calculate the contribution is readily available. It needs to be consistently applied across sectors to prevent that within or between industry conflict. And it needs to be affordable and proportionate to sector activities. Ultimately, doing nothing is not an option, and marine net gain needs to become a focus for management. The main concept of delivering net gain as part of any development is a fundamentally and universally welcome one, and there's clear consensus that we need to address biodiversity decline, and it makes sense to do that through development. However, there are concerns that the current intertidal metric may not be workable, and challenges remain if the metric is to be used to deliver intertidal biodiversity net gain. A strategic approach for the marine environment is required, and this is supported for intertidal habitats too. marine industries have strongly reiterated that consideration should be applied to applying marine net gain to above marine low water as well as below it, and that would give a consistent approach across habitats. A contributions-based approach as opposed to a metric is preferred, but it does need to be linked to that residual environmental impact of the project. Ultimately, though, whatever accounting system is implemented, other components of the system do need to be developed, and so far there hasn't been a lot of work on progressing the strategic framework to actually support marine net gain implementation. So if approaches are adopted before adequately addressing these strategic issues, we are actually in danger of creating an obligation without a practical means of delivery. So we do need to have care. Any approach adopted in the marine environment should provide flexibility to enable developers to find and deliver their own marine net gain projects. But these will ultimately need to fall within some form of strategic objectives for marine net gain. And so some work identifying priority locations and objectives for these strategic interventions is key. And then finally, any new approach would require focused monitoring and review. And so it needs to be implemented with within some form of overall adaptive management framework that's linked to government biodiversity targets and ultimately subject to some form of periodic formal evaluation to check that it is actually working and that we're gaining enough net gain to do the initiatives we feel are required. So ultimately, that is net gain, and I hope you all found that interesting. Well, I'll obviously open this up to any questions, but if we don't get to them all, this is my email should anyone want to contact me after. We do also have a LinkedIn group where we try and share up-to-date information on sort of marine net gain, and that's called Marine Environmental Net Gain, and you'll find it if you search on LinkedIn. So please feel free to follow that as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vicky. That was a really, really interesting presentation and a comprehensive overview of what's happening with marine net gain at the moment. Please do, attendees, put any of your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So we'll now move into the Q&A section. You mentioned right at the beginning of your presentation, Vicky, about the distinction between marine net gain and environmental net gain. Do you think what you've talked about today in terms of putting forward marine net gain is complementary to the natural capital approach and kind of working towards environmental net gain in the marine environment?
Yeah, I think so. Sort of, especially in the marine environment, because it is so dynamic in nature, specifying it down to a habitat parcel level doesn't really complement the approach, because you look at birds, mammals, and different receptor groups, they operate across a whole area. So having that wider environmental approach is definitely going to be a more encompassing way of measuring it. The problem is the actual application of that is very difficult, which is why we're seeing biodiversity net gain at this point. And obviously we've got to start somewhere, and the sooner we start, the quicker we get those benefits. So yeah, sometimes it's walking before you can run, but ultimately, yeah, we want to end up towards that environmental net gain.
Amazing, thank you. I'll move on to some of the attendee questions coming in. We've got quite a few. So do you see a future tie-in with potential nutrient neutrality measures that are becoming more important in marine special areas of conservation?
Ultimately, yes, that's quite a specific question. I wasn't expecting something like that. Yes, some of that would probably come into how you look at maybe the condition assessment of the habitat. So when we look at net gain, you classify it as your intertidal mud, but then there are a range of condition factors that feed into that to give it that high, medium, low quality. So probably some of those nutrient factors would come into that element of it.
Amazing, thank you. And is there any indication that net gain requirements are incentivizing more avoidance of impacts from developments, for example, at earlier stages in the mitigation hierarchy?
Yes, I think so. I think from the experience we've had, it's very early doors with this, but it's definitely something companies are very aware that they're going to have to do. So I think even now they're thinking about, yes, avoiding those impacts to start with. Can they maybe do the development in a different way? Then also, what can they do on site as opposed to having to find their land off site? So it's definitely pushing towards those earlier stages in the hierarchy. Yeah.
That's really good to hear. Could biodiversity net gain be used as a carbon offset credit for purposes of striving towards a company's net zero ambition?
I think ultimately that's a policy decision. And actually some of, as I say, that policy is still not, we're not sure where that's going to come. There still needs to be clarification on some of these positions. But as it stands, no, it's not going to look at sort of carbon neutral offsetting.
And can you give an example of marine net gain may require or look like in the marine environment, for example, in contrast to the intertidal where habitat creation is possible?
Well, that's one of the biggest questions, is because everyone knows that, well, one, it's not really being done, but subtidal creation is going to be extremely challenging. You know, if you ruin a subtidal sandbank, how do you replace it? Some habitats, there's obviously more ongoing with this than others. So oysters and seagrass, things like that in a subtidal nature, there's work ongoing. But I think this is where this sort of contributions-based approach concept comes in, is that there'll be higher strategic goals towards that, so that industry aren't doing their own piecemeal approach to some of this, which then ultimately won't lead to gains because they can't, say, do a subtidal sandbank creation themselves. So yeah, it's about creating that pot of money that can actually do something better with it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Another question coming in here is, it seems that proposed net gain habitat alterations are permanent. How are risks factored in and mitigated for? For example, increased bursting at the jetty upsetting nearby habitats, or a lack of knowledge about the functioning of the ecosystem being removed, etc.
So again, I'm not sure how it will work in terms of the marine, but when we look at the intertidal metric, it does build in risk factors. So depending on the habitat, it's got a set score within that metric, but it accounts for, as I said, there were three factors. It's delivery risk, temporal risk, and spatial risk. So the delivery risk is basically how much do we know about that habitat, how easy is it to create from the examples we've done, and then also the temporal risk is how long do we think that that's going to take to get up to the standard that we want. And depending on that habitat, those are factored in, which ultimately means you need to provide more units in relation to, so it kind of provides a buffer for that. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And going back to what we were talking about, marine net gain in the marine environment, how do you think we can deal with industries that are not considered to be development as such, but something like fisheries?
Fisheries is the biggest question. At the moment, they are completely outside of the scope for marine net gain. So it is going to be completely development-based activities. So really anything that requires a marine license is considered to be in scope. The fisheries question is probably one more for policymakers, because ultimately, you know, it is destructive. And as I said, it's very difficult. A lot of the measures that would really help are going to be ones that reduce fisheries pressure. But as I mentioned, you can't have one industry paying another industry not to operate. So there's potentially ways that if it's done through that government fund, that ultimately if the government then come up with ways that reduces efficient pressure, that might work. But yeah, not a physical industry being able to do that.
Amazing. Another attendee here saying very fair points made about the case study that you talked about and the metrics replacement ratio in this example. As they understand it, the metric allows more units to be created if habitats are created a few years in advance. Do you think a strong response from the market to create strategic projects early could help to address this?
Yes, I think we're very aware that you can reduce the number of units that you need to provide if you do it ahead of time. I think because Natural England actually in that example, they do provide an example where it's 10 years ahead of time and you can see the difference in the units that creates. I think the problem we have with that element of it is that if you look at, say, a typical port company or someone, they're not thinking 10 years ahead of time. So it's really atypical of where industry are with this. I think there are going to become habitat banks where you might be able to purchase these units, which ultimately would work on that concept. But for say that example where we're 10 years ahead of time, we're really only doing net gain now. So that's not going to apply for anyone that's doing development until sort of 2032. So does that mean that no development can go ahead before then because it's all too expensive to do for them at the moment, which is then ultimately just going to completely crush the economy because nobody's able to develop and move forward. So it does need to be considered in that proportionality of what industry can actually afford to do alongside their development as well.
Great, thank you. Do you foresee any government guidance on marine environmental enhancements which could be used to achieve net gain? From an industry perspective, it's going to be difficult to know how to enhance habitats from poor quality to moderate or good to achieve a 10% net gain for development.
Yes, I think whether that comes directly through government or not, there is definitely already stuff out there in the literature that looks at how you can improve habitats and restoration activities. You know, you take oysters, for example, there's the Oyster Restoration Handbook. There's also quite a lot of work done on managed realignment schemes for mudflat, salt marsh, and things you can do to get to that end goal. So there's also, because of the way they account for condition within the metric, there are those, you can look at those condition scores. So one of them is litter, for instance. So if you've got an area that's covered in litter and you remove the amount of litter that's there, that could potentially take your score down to give you or up, I should say, to give you moderate instead of poor, or things like that. So there's definitely evidence out there to be able to do some of these things already. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Vicky. I think only time for one more question. Thank you for bearing with us. It's great to see so many questions coming through. With the requirement for biodiversity net gain in the subtidal environment fast approaching, are the regulators on board with the contribution approach? From recent SNCB consultation, it appears that they would still be looking at project-based offsetting. Will this be something that is enacted as part of the policy?
Well, as I say, so the work we did was on behalf of Defra. So it is certainly something they're considering. But as I say, it didn't sort of come, or it didn't determine any of those policy decisions. So I know they are looking at different approaches. Ultimately, we think that's what this consultation is going to be on. So it will look at some of those different policy approaches and how they might work and gain people's views. As I said, we were sort of expecting that back in November, so we're now thinking we'll see it probably sometime this summer. But yeah, ultimately we'll wait till the consultation and the responses from that.
Amazing, thank you. And just one quick one that's just come in, because this can be a quick answer. Is the report for Defra publicly available yet, the one you've been talking about?
Not yet, but it is their intention to publish it. So if it's published, anyone who follows that LinkedIn group, we can put a link on there for that.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. And I will send around that link to the LinkedIn group. I can put it on our website if that's helpful. I'm sorry if I didn't make it to your questions today. Thank you so much to Vicky. That was a really great presentation, some really interesting discussion afterwards. And thank you to all the attendees for logging in. I hope you found that as beneficial and informative as I did.